I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music. On this podcast, Tom and I discuss a smattering of topics pertaining to modern music, including artist deep dives, random music topics, and even album reviews.
Oh.
Dun, dun, dun. Foreshadowing. Before we get started, you can help support Velocities in Music. Subscribe to Velocities in Music on your favorite podcasting device to automatically get our latest podcast episode sent to your device for your listening pleasure. Want to help Velocities in Music grow? You can. Velocities in Music was founded on the idea of creating an enriching discussion about modern music. Please share Velocities in Music with the music enthusiasts in your life. Together, we can move music discussion forward. Tom, it's good to see you, my friend.
You too, dude.
It's really good to see you. It's been too long since we've done this.
I agree.
I feel like life is catching up with us. I feel like I'm on the wrong side of 30. You're on the right side of 30. And
Not for long, though.
Not for long. And because of just this inevitable thing called age, you know, almost 10 years into Velocities in Music's history, we're slowing down.
It's wild, yeah.
We're slowing down. But it's not because we want to slow down.
Nope.
Because music is still out there. Music is still it's still begging us to listen to it.
Music doesn't slow down. I'll tell you that.
Music never slows down.
It doesn't slow down for anyone.
Oh, no. You check every Friday and see all the albums that are released. It's overwhelming.
Yeah.
It is overwhelming. And actually, Tom, I got to say, because we've been in various music leagues right now, we have a Velocities in Music League running that is covering all the songs from 2018, the best songs from 2018. Each week we do a new month from 2018. So we started with January and then February each week. And Tom, I just want to give you credit because you have taken the time every month to make a list, go on Metacritic and write down, here's all the albums that were released. And you preview every single one of them.
I try.
That has been so
tough,
helpful to me. That has been so helpful.
Good to hear it.
So helpful. So, and that's kept me abreast of all the new music that's been coming out. But today, we're not going to talk about new music.
No.
We're going to talk about old music. Tom, can you introduce what Velocities in Music is going to discuss today?
Yes. So, a little bit of background first. As we have started Velocities in Music leagues, our last topic in which me and Jake talked about our musical upbringing was a request of the winner of the first Velocities in Music League. Well, today's topic is the request of the second Velocities in Music League winner, Jeremy Nifras.
Season 2. Yep.
Jeremy, thank you for your request on this. And Jeremy, actually, he's been a listener of ours, a watcher of ours when we were doing music reviews since almost the beginning, nearly 10 years ago. So, Jeremy, got to give you a shout out. Really appreciate you as a listener and always providing feedback and you know, keeping the conversation going. I really appreciate that.
Absolutely. I second that. And thanks, Jeremy, for slaughtering us.
Oh my God. He shamed everyone in that league.
He
ran with it.
Oh man, he took us to town. That's all there is to it.
So what Jeremy asked of us for this podcast is he wanted us to get us talking about an album again, focusing on an album. But he left that decision up to us. What he said is he wanted us to pick an album that's one of our favorites, one of our mutual favorites, and just to talk about it and dissect it track by track. So it's kind of like an expanded version of the album reviews that we used to do. More detailed. It's going to be longer than those, which used to average maybe 8 to 10 minutes. This is going to be longer form for the podcast. But obviously not as expansive as like a deep dive where we talk through every album of an artist's discography. So I've been pretty excited about this because it feels like our wheelhouse, Jake, but it's giving us the opportunity to, open up the conversation a little bit deeper.
Yeah, it feels a little bit like the last 20 minutes of Return of the King, where there's a lot of sunsets and tears, and it feels like you're going home. That's what it feels like right now.
I was wondering where you were going with that.
Getting back to our roots. That's what we're doing. We're back to the Shire.
Yes, exactly. Trying to find our footing again. So
if you could pick an album, Tom, that we both think is great, but we haven't talked about before in Velocities in Music because we have in the past repeated ourselves, but we don't want to do that tonight. This is a special thing right here.
It is. So what we're going with is we decided to pick Talking Heads debut album, Talking Heads 77. And I'm at first I was like, well, seems like kind of a weird pick, but once I started diving into it and, putting my reviewing hat on, my podcasting hat on in preparation for this, I listened to this album several times, and it's amazing when you're preparing to talk about an album, how differently you listen to it, even if it's an album you've listened to dozens or hundreds of times. Yes. Every time, Jake, that never fails to surprise me. And that happened with this album as well. This is an album I've been listening to for a long time. It's actually the first Talking Heads album I ever really got into.
No way.
Yeah, and it's one that, Jake, you and I have listened to together before, but somehow we've just never really had like a deep conversation about it. We've never gotten into the details.
I honestly don't know what your thoughts are on this album. I assume you like it because it is Talking Heads, right? It's pretty definitive, Talking Heads being their debut album and really establishing them in the music world, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I do love this album. So, Jake, years ago, you and I did a review of Talking Heads' album Remain in Light.
Terrible album.
Which is considered by many, kind of understood as their magnum opus, their masterpiece. Which actually, I would argue this is a band that, really, to me, their first 5 albums are all just about masterpiece level.
Yep.
But before that, Talking Heads 77 for a long time was my favorite album, and I had trouble getting into Remain in Light. I didn't really attach to it until we reviewed it. So before that, Talking Heads 77 was my go-to favorite Talking Heads album.
Oh, awesome.
Now I would give it a close second to Remain in Light. I do like Remain in Light better. I think that's just a more rewarding and rich experience when I listen to it. But I still have a soft spot for Talking Heads 77, but it's been a lot of fun digging into why and stepping outside of myself and thinking what is it that I like about this album?
Well, let's start with what year it came out, Tom.
Well, it came out in 1977.
Holy cow, I never saw it coming.
Indicate.
Can you, Tom, as our resident music historian, the H in your first name really stands for historian. Could you give us a little bit of background? What was the world of music like in 1977? It was a strange time in music. Talking Heads, this is their first record, so it's not like they were very well known before this. This is also pre-Brian Eno working with Talking Heads, so all manner of precedence is not established yet for this band and this sound.
Jake, let me get into that. And if you'll indulge me, I
always do.
You always do. You always do. And I love you for it. I appreciate that because I really want to dive into the deep end with the context of this album because I think it's important and it's something that we'll come back to as we break this down track by track. This album is also interesting in that we're choosing to dissect it tonight because honestly, it's one that in the research I've done on it, it doesn't seem like a very highly documented album.
Agreed.
Have you noticed that? Even the Wikipedia page is pretty sparse on it.
I did not find a ton of information about this record or the history around it, or just like when we were doing the Bowie deep dive earlier in 2018, there was so much history around every single record. I just kind of expected a band with the profile like the Talking Heads have to have that level of just availability of information that's just not there for Talking Heads 77.
No, it's really not, which is interesting. It puts us a little bit in the dark, but I kind of like that. And that's why I want to focus more not just on the world of the Talking Heads at this time, but the world of music at this time. So, 1977, Talking Heads are a band from New York, and they were part of the what has been considered kind of the big 4 acts of the CBGB's New York scene, and that was Television, Ramones, and Patti Smith along with them. Talking Heads, of those other 3, were actually the last to record and release their debut album. But what's interesting is those other acts have a much more punk-rooted sound. Taking that in different directions a little bit, in the same way that when we talk about grunge, all the bands labeled as grunge don't sound exactly the same. Well, it's not that these bands sound all that much alike, but they emerged from the same mid to late 70s New York scene. Well, let's expand that even a little bit more and look at the larger musical movements that were happening in 1977, and then I'd like to relate those back to this album. So I've got a very exhaustive list here, Jake, of some genres and artists that came out with albums in 1977 that I want to tie together, because 1977 is one of my favorite years in music. Talking Heads 77 is a reason for that. But it was a huge year for punk music in general.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned Television with Marquee Moon, Ramones with Rocket to Russia came out that year. Then you also had Sex Pistols. You had the debut album by Wire. You had the debut album from The Clash. You had The Damned coming out with an album. You had Suicide. You had Iggy Pop. These are huge, influential albums from 1977. That also bleeds into like kind of the birth of new wave and some more art rock side of that. Like with Ian Dury and the Blockheads. Elvis Costello's debut album came out that year. God, what a year for debut albums, right? Then on the more art rock kind of pop side of it, there's Brian Eno came out with an album that year. ELO, Electric Light Orchestra, Peter Gabriel's first solo album. David Bowie had both Low and Heroes. That was the beginning of his Berlin era. Pink Floyd had Animals on the prog rock side. You had some hard rock masterpieces from AC/DC, Meatloaf, Cheap Trick. Maybe not masterpieces, but at least monoliths. In the pop world...
whatever, man. Meatloaf is a masterpiece.
Are you talking about the food?
Well, yeah.
Okay.
But also the music.
But yeah, I mean, Bad Outta Hell came out that year, and that's a pretty big album. But that also kind of bleeds into the pop side, where you have Steely Dan and Billy Joel and Fleetwood Mac and Eric Clapton and Jackson Browne all came out with big albums for themselves.
Are you, real quick,
yeah?
How in-depth is this rant? Because you mentioned Meatloaf's Bad Outta Hell, and I have an awesome story, random tangent that I could go on, not relating to this at all. It's just a funny anecdote I could toss
Well, now
in.
you have to share it.
Well, and I don't know if you want to leave this in or not, but like I have to tell this story now.
Well, I'll probably leave it in.
So my dad collected records. He's an ex-hippie, right? Like he grew up in the 70s, was in college in the 70s, right? Had a nice record collection and retained some of those records into my childhood and my adult life. My brother, who actually got my younger brother Coleman, who got into vinyl before I did, started to pillage my father's record collection because my dad doesn't have a record player anymore, and he found in my dad's record collection Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. One of my brother's favorite albums, everyone's favorite albums, opens it up. Oh no, it's not Dark Side. It's Meatloaf's Bad Outta Hell inside a Dark Side. And my brother is so crushed. He's so devastated.
He got Trojan horsed by Meatloaf.
Yeah, because he's a freshman in college or something like that at this point. He's broke. He doesn't have money to go out and buy Dark Side at record store prices nowadays. He even used that thing's $25-$30 for a bad copy. So years pass. We're at my grandma's house. And my grandma's like, well, there's some vinyl records out in the garage, Coleman. Go out and check them out. So he's going through this. Keep in mind, this is like 3 years later. And he's thumbing through the records and he finds Meatloaf's Bad Outta Hell. And he goes, oh no, it can't be. This can't be happening right now. So he slowly pulls it out of the crate, dusts it off, sticks his hand in, and pulls the record out. And it's Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon.
Oh, yes.
These two records had been separated for 30 years. And they were reunited.
That is awesome.
Yeah, isn't that just the most batshit crazy story?
The only thing that could make that story better is if he pulled it out and it was another copy of Meatloaf's Bad Outta Hell. Like somehow it just transformed into Meatloaf. The Pink Floyd album did.
As dumb as that story is, I feel like it had to be shared, and I do apologize for interrupting your absolutely eloquent rant that you had. That's a
fantastic story, and it needs to be heard. So let me dive back in here.
I'm gonna pull away and giggle for a minute.
All right, so diving back into the musical landscape of 1977. I talked about punk. I talked about new wave, kind of art rock and prog, hard rock, pop, Now, there's also a lot of like soul and funk and reggae and Afrobeat going on. You have Al Green. Parliament put out their album Funkadelic versus the Placebo Syndrome that year. Fantastic album. We had landmark albums from Bob Marley, The Congos, Fela Kuti. And then also, like, somehow, like, as an outlier to all this, there was disco. Like, disco was big with the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack, and also just, a ton of disco hits coming out around that time. So, why do I go at length to talk about all these? The reason I do is because there's actually a lot of overlap if you were to create a giant, like, multi-bubble Venn diagram of all these styles, right? You look at New Wave, and New Wave had its roots in punk, and there was some punk that was kind of forward-looking and proggy and more artistic. You look at artists like Brian Eno and the solo stuff he was putting out, which was still coming out of his Roxy Music days, which had some kind of glam rock and punk vibes to that, which also kind of bleeds in with what David Bowie was doing at the time. At the same time, you have hard rock like AC/DC and Meatloaf that had, like that Meatloaf album really has some kind of artsy and like poppy elements to it. You had Eric Clapton, who was pulling a lot from blues and even reggae artists around that time. There was a soul element to that as well. So there's just this huge collection of music coming out that at first glance might seem very separate, but there are kind of like, there are artists that kind of sit in the middle and bridge the gap between each of those really disparate genres. When I listen to Talking Heads 77, what amazes me about it is that it somehow doesn't exclusively fit in with any one of those buckets, but somehow has elements of every single one of them. Mm-hmm. On this album, you hear elements of punk in the guitar and drum style, in the kind of bare production. This is considered a kind of epitomal new wave album, so of course you hear that. You hear this kind of art rock or art pop styling with the attention to detail with added instrumentation. There's certainly a pop element to it and just how melodic and bright it is. But then there's also kind of like soul and funk and reggae vibes at time, especially with the way that the bass grooves are highlighted, with some of the more exotic instrumentation that's introduced at times, like steel drum and whirros. They're taking all of this and blending it, and yet they're making this album that's so unlike anything else and so still like unified. All the songs on this album really truly belong together and sound enough alike to make sense together, even though they're synthesizing so many different kinds of sounds. It's one of those where I think that when you have an album that's bringing together so many different musical elements, it is destined to sound unique if they're doing it successfully, because no one style really dominates more than like 10% of what you're hearing. There's so many slices to the pie that is Talking Heads 77 that it's really somewhat hard to define musically. But then from there, the way they're actually writing these songs, and in particular how David Byrne is contributing to them with his lyrics and vocal persona, is really what sets this apart from everything else that was coming out at the time and has come out since, really.
Well said, Tom. Well said. I agree with everything that you said. I want to dig into a little bit before we start going through this album track by track.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to ask you, Tom, do you feel like Talking Head 77 is one of the greatest records of all time? Does it deserve to be on a top 100 list of greatest records, rock records of all time?
That's a tough question, because for me, it is. I like this album a lot, and I have for a long time, but it's one of those albums that it's actually odd to me how much other people like it. I would almost expect it to be a more niche listen, and I'm surprised that it's gotten the acclaim that it has and that it's gone down in history as one of the greatest, because it's one to me that like, despite its poppiness and its accessibility in the sound, it's such an oddball of an album that I'm surprised that so many people have been able to relate to it. Honestly, if I'm looking at it objectively, like, there's so much good going on here, but in a way, like, there's only maybe really one or two tracks that stick out to me as like, oh my gosh, this song's a masterpiece. This album to me is all about the package deal.
Yep,
And
I agree with
from that perspective, it's you know, the songs are better together than they are on their own. And I would have a hard time saying it's like one of the best ever, like when you put it up against even some of the albums that were coming out in the year 1977. But for some reason, this album just warms me. I still just love it. So that I feel like I really skirted around the actual question you were asking, Jake.
You did a great job of not answering and just praising the album. Here's what I would say.
I think it does deserve its place, but I don't know if I'd put it in like the top 100.
I think Rolling Stone's top 500, I forget exactly what it ranks at, but I think it's in the top 300, which I think is fair. If you look at all the music over time, I think top 250, top 300 is absolutely fair. So I think that that's good enough to call this a truly great, historically great record. I want to dive into what a few key factors that make Talking Heads 77 worth knowing intimately no matter what type of music you're into. If you say that you love music, why should you dig into Talking Heads 77? In essence, what makes this such a great album? I have a few reasons off the top of my head, Tom. I'm happy to start throwing those out there, but
dig into it, man.
I want to hear what your thoughts are too.
Okay.
The first thing, the thing that I have to draw on, because all those things you said about how they approach the sound, what the scene was like at the time, it really kind of it kind of all culminates around a sense of originality that I think Talking Heads just innately provided. They don't know how to do anything but be overtly original, which is fantastic. Originality to me is the number one most important aspect a band can bring to the table, right? So the fact that they were original automatically gets them the notoriety they deserve. Plus, they just have fantastic songwriting. If you look throughout Talking Head 77, these songs aren't particularly crazy in their structure or in their songwriting. They're not doing anything that really has never been done before from a songwriting perspective. But what they're doing is they're taking very, very almost brutalist sonic elements. Every one of these songs has drums, bass, electric guitar, and David Byrne's vocals. Sometimes there's electric keys and piano there, but that's it. That's all the instruments that they use, with some auxiliary percussion effects in there as well. But really, there's just a core sound here. What they focused on was very, very intentional use of dynamics and absolutely brilliant instrumentation throughout this record. There is not a track on here that I would say the songwriting really takes a step down. Every song just operates at this upper echelon of high quality songwriting. Every song has great dynamics and great instrumental performances. You couple that with David Byrne's vocal performances. In my mind, without David Byrne's vocal personas, as you said, Tom, on this record, this is just a good album. David Byrne is what makes this a great record, because he really, as a vocalist, he isn't that good.
No. He's not going to be winning any singing competitions.
Definitely not. Yeah. The way he sings, he's trying to hit notes that he can't hit. His voice just doesn't have that great of a tone to it. But it comes off as just passionately quirky, and he's his personality is just exploding into the microphone on every single song, and you can't help but think, man, this asshole is just manic as all get out, and he is so passionate. He's just killing it on every track. It's infectious. It sucks you into the music. It brings your mind and your ears into all of the other elements that are going on, and that's where the true brilliance happens, is because the bass parts, the guitar riffs, the piano bits, the drum beats, they're all in this weird syncopation with David Byrne's vocals. And his vocal approach is somewhat unique in the fact that he is actually not rhyming things. He's just kind of belting out just prose. I don't know what you would call it, but it and the lyrical subject matter is all he's tackling subject matters that really weren't being tackled at the time. Again, being original with their sound, and it just makes for just this end to end, completely unique, original, and very well executed composition that does sound better as a whole than just an individual few tracks here and there.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, and I would like to even pick it apart a little bit further. I want to focus on one thing that you mentioned around David Byrne's persona and the lyrics, especially. The things he's singing about, you're absolutely right, are not being tackled by really anyone else around that time. In the hard rock space, you have people like Meatloaf and very shortly Van Halen and AC/DC who are singing, it's kind of this kind of bravado type of lyricism,
like hair metal.
Exactly. And then you have punk music, which is just like deliberately rebellious and aggressive, right? And David Byrne's just singing about like suburban middle class working life in a very objective way. And I have a theory about this, Jake. You're gonna have to ride this crazy train with me for a moment, because I have a theory. In preparing for this, I've come to the conclusion that I think you could almost listen to this as a type of concept album with a story arc. And this is kind of like Bigfoot conspiracy theory Tom coming out here, because I can't say that this was necessarily the intent. I don't have anything to back this up, but just the unique way that David Byrne approaches the lyrics and the content on this album makes me think that this is possible. He's singing about such like mundane and everyday things that he almost sounds like an alien that came to Earth, observed the behavior of like suburban middle class humans for 2 years, and then wanted to write an album about what he saw. There's this, and what I mean by that, I'm not actually purporting that David Byrne is an alien. That sounds more like a David Bowie type storyline right there.
I was going to say, this sounds like something George Clinton would do.
Yeah, but what I mean is that there's this childlike naivety to what David Byrne is singing about, and it makes his album simultaneously endearing as well as perplexing. He's singing about hanging out with his friends, and he's singing about going to work and his first week at a new job, and how happy of a day he's having. And like, it's this kind of bizarre thing that you're hearing come from what sounds like some weird man-child, that you're like, why is he focusing on all of these just everyday aspects of adult life, relationships, work, friendships? Compared to other music coming out in the time, also, he really doesn't have that much attitude in his vocals. In a time where vocalists were really gritty, or really, like, I mean, he is very impassioned. You mentioned that, Jake. He gets kind of crazed at times, but it's not very, like...
it's mania, not passion, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. He gets a little like unhinged, but not necessarily like deliberately like angry or anything.
He doesn't know. It's like he's beside himself. He can't help himself but just be as fanatical as possible.
Right. But you compare that to like Elvis Costello, who I think stylistically is a somewhat similar new wave type of artist.
Good comp.
But Elvis Costello's lyrics are so poetic, and there's so many different layers to them, and he's trying to create through these like metaphors and conceit this deeper picture. And I feel like David Byrne's lyrics are the polar opposite of that. He's singing exactly about just like surface level observations of human life. And not really picking it apart for you in any way. In some ways, he feels more like a game show host than like an authoritative lead singer of a rock band. He sounds like he's presenting you, like he's Vanna White, just presenting to you these like ideas and then letting you do what you will with them. So my point in all this rambling is, I think if you dig into the album as a whole, the impression that I get is almost that he's like satirizing the traditional working class life by just like focusing on how dull it is, instead of like giving that away explicitly and explaining it to the listener and making the interpretation for you. He just hammers it into you every song until there's not much way to interpret it. Almost like the overexposure to this kind of like cyclical lifestyle becomes almost kind of numbing to you. It's similar to what the monotony of working life could do to people. You know what I mean? And I actually think that there's somewhat of a story arc in this that comes to a head with the second to last track, Psycho Killer, where this narrator kind of finally just his mind breaks and it goes a little bit crazy. Now, I don't have anything big to back that up. I don't have any like sources to cite, but I feel like that's the kind of thing he's putting together here, and it's so unique.
I love that as an idea. I also have no way of backing that up, but I'm super intrigued now, and I want to dive in.
That's why we got to dive into track by track, and I'll let you know why I kind of see how I see each song contributing to that. So when we dive into each of these songs, let's talk about songwriting. Let's talk about the instrumentation, and then let's also take a little bit on the lyrics as well.
Let's do it.
All right, you ready to kick it off with track 1?
I will. Okay, Tom. So track 1 on Talking Head 77. Opens up with a track called "Uh-Oh, Love Comes to Town." It's a 2-minute It's a 2-minute 48-second opening track, and the thing that I noticed right away, it really defining the sound of the album, which I'm always looking for on a great album, especially a debut album. But that opening track, its job is to define the sound of the album.
Jump back, sit back, get back, relax. It's okay. I called in sick, I won't go to work today.
What makes this interesting is "Uh-Oh, Love Comes to Town" is probably the safest track on the album, I would say. Maybe the closing track is also safer, but I feel like this is a fantastic opener. It's weird and establishes the sound of those instruments I mentioned before, where you have the electric guitars, very kind of a post-punk vibe to them, early post-punk vibe. You have the bass line, you have this killer bass line, you have all these layered guitars, and then you have the steel pan that gives us this tropical vibe. And it kind of just builds up, and it has this really nice dynamic build towards the end of the song. But this entire thing feels somewhat comfortable. It's aesthetically pleasing, whereas I don't feel like the rest of the songs on the record really ever hit this level of aesthetically pleasing again. You're kind of in for a ride once you listen to "Uh-Oh, Love Comes to Town."
Yeah, I love the laid back kind of funk groove of this, and you're absolutely right. That steel drum that comes in gives it a really nice, like kind of exotic island feel to it. There's also like really softly like a harmonica that plays along with the chorus just to beef it up a little bit. And that's something that we'll hear throughout this album that I'll try to highlight when I was able to catch it. But they're really great at putting these subtle like auxiliary instrumentation in there, whether it's piano, harmonica and steel drum I mentioned. That's something you're not always going to hear on the debut album first track from a rock band. Especially, Jake, as you mentioned earlier, this is a very guitar, bass, drums, and vocals rooted album. Every song has those elements, so it feels like a standard rock setup, but they're doing some artistic stuff with it. It very much feels like an art school kind of vibe. But this also, what we're introduced to with the sound, is this very clean guitar tone that really pervades the whole album. The guitar almost never gets very heavy. It's just this light crunch to give the really full-bodied, kind of high-end chords that they're playing on the guitars, just a lot of brightness to them. And then that thunking bass line and the very studious drums that just kind of drive everything, but never really get above like a 7 out of 10 on the intensity scale. This song sets it up really well. To take a moment and talk about the message of this song, what are the lyrics about? I mean, the title of the song kind of says it all. "Uh-oh, love comes to town." David Byrne talks about how love can have a tendency to derail a normal person in their professional and personal lives. It can bring down your productivity and motivation. It disarms you in a way. And he's taking that kind of professional world where he's going through these like professions, saying like basically like pilots will crash planes and things will go wrong when people get in love, right? So he's connecting that professional world and the romantic relationships and finding a way to bridge those together, both of which will be central themes to the album's lyrics as we move through it. So right off the bat, you're getting a pretty typical taste of what's to come on the rest of the album.
Track 2 on Talking Head 77 is New Feeling.
It's not yesterday anymore. I go visiting.
New Feeling opens up with this groovy riff, but really leads into the guitars that Tom mentioned, that very clean sounding, crunchy electric guitar that really is, I think, the defining sound of Talking Head 77. It's found throughout on every single song. You hear that. And New Feeling is all about that electric guitar.
I like that it feels a little funkier than punky to me. But this is also a place where I think that we could compare them to their fellow New Yorkers in television, because television had that notorious what's been called like double helix guitar approach, where the guitars kind of weave in and out of each other. And I like that on this track you have those panned left and right guitar tracks, and they're strumming in slightly different rhythms, so it creates this cool kind of stereo vibe. And then in the lyrics, I'm gonna mention the lyrics in like every track here. So
you have to,
because
you have to on an album.
I have
like
to
this.
defend my thesis statement here.
Of course.
So the lyrics in New Feeling are more about social situations. The new feeling that comes with it being a new day and meeting new people, and how that can be kind of an exciting sensation for someone, maybe just burgeoning into an adult lifestyle.
And at this point in the record, you're 6 minutes into the record, and you're really starting to understand how much production has played into the creation of this sound. Everything is so thick and full sounding and yet insular at the same time. And I think that's just Tom, you're really the expert in this area, but like to me, just the way that they produce each individual instrument, there's not a lot of distortion or anything to fill out the sound. Everything is so isolated. It feels cold at times, but it's still at the same time so well produced, and it sounds so thick that it just has a very solid sonic footprint to it.
That's a really great point, and let me say that's not just the production, it's also the writing.
Yes, definitely.
The production is really tight, but one thing that just good songwriters will do, especially when you're in a rock band and you have that guitar, bass, and drums lineup, is you'll write your parts to line up and work together. So you have the kick drum and the bass complementing each other. You have guitar chords landing in the right spots to line up with big cymbal crashes, stuff like that. Talking Heads were really great at this. Everything about the drums, bass, and guitar were very deliberate. And when you write your songs that way and you perform them tightly and accurately, the production is really just takes it up a level, but all the proper elements are there to just have a very consummate sound. The instrumentals work together so well, and yeah, New Feeling is a great example of that.
Track 3 on Talking Head 77 is Tentative Decisions.
Say they're concerned that they are concerned with these ideas, and it's a hard logic to follow, and the girls get lost.
Tentative Decisions is this moodier piece. It has this big anthemic chorus that's driven by piano and this snare drum that's kind of like this like marching band.
Yeah.
I really dig the approach there. And then it has the harmonized vocals with David Byrne kind of taking the lead on that, obviously, but the whole band joining in.
Yeah, I love the kind of military feel to it. And this, in the chorus, it's also, here's a production note, it's also one of the rare moments on the album where there are multiple vocal layers. You actually don't get a lot of harmonization or like layered vocals at all on this album. It's usually pretty much just like one David Byrne track with maybe a little bit of delay to give it some body. But I like the big kind of like chorus approach here when the snare drums are going and it feels like you're marching. It's kind of a cool effect. Also, that kind of honky-tonk piano at the end that's a little bit more percussive, highlights the rhythm more so than the melody. I love that effect. Real quick on the lyrics, we're going from In the previous track, which was the excitement about social situations, we're going into kind of the darker side of that, what the tension that social situations can cause, especially when you're getting like heterosexual relationships between men and women and the tension that can be brought there. It's actually interesting because on the original lyrics, the inner sleeve of the lyrics, I have this one on vinyl, halfway through the lyrics for this song, it just stops and says, repeat with reversal of gender. Kind of an interesting
cool.
note.
That's super cool.
So basically what he's doing with the last half of the song is looking at it from the other gender's perspective. So it's highlighting that tension that can happen when normal relationships and the thrill of meeting new people is all of a sudden complicated with the idea of romance.
Track 4 on Talking Head 77 is a track called Happy Day.
Fell all over and I couldn't stand up. I can't be critical of who's got such a happy day for me.
I think Happy Day is one of the more interesting songs on Talking Head 77. It to me isn't a leader in terms of melody or hooks, but Tom, and I want you to dive into this. This is definitely one of the more lyrically diverse songs, and it presents a really nice change of pace as far as just the tone of the song is concerned.
Yeah, it's very blissful. It's almost kind of sedated and fantastical.
Which goes very well with the track title.
It does, yeah. It's very obvious the kind of vibe that they're going for, and they highlight that in the track title as well. I like that there's this, if you pay attention, there's this very low in the mix kind of twinkling like xylophone that highlights some of the key chord changes in there. But this song, yeah, it's almost this kind of, you feel like you're floating when you're listening to it. One interesting thing I want to pull out of the lyrics is he worked the line, "I want to talk," in there, which is a key line from the previous song, Tentative Decisions. But the context there, juxtaposing those, I think is interesting because that's a common thread that these two songs have, but where Tentative Decisions was kind of a nervous song, Happy Day takes that and it's like forgetting all the cares in the world and just being blissful for a moment.
I'm starting to realize while you're putting together this hypothesis that this is a concept album, because when you have lyrical references in tracks that are right next to each other, it definitely shows that the artist is taking the time to really have a strategy and think through the listening experience as a work of art.
I think they did. And also not only lyrically, but you'll notice some of these songs flow right into each other. Not that there's like a seamless transition, but sometimes just because the instrumental approach is so similar and so smooth, a song just kicks right in and you hardly registered that the previous song ended. That's happens several times here as well.
That's very true. I really think that going from track 3, Tentative Decisions, to track 4, Happy Day, in the next track 5, Who Is It, it really flows nicely. Like, you can get lost in the music. While they are separate, disparate tracks, it does absolutely flow very well as an album. Track 5, Who Is It?
Who is it? Who is it? What is it? What is it? What is it? What is it?
Who is it? This is really this is in comparison to the tracks, the 4 tracks that came before this. This is far shorter at 1:41.
Yeah.
And I Tom, you actually turned me on to the idea that songs that are under 2 minutes that accomplish a lot are just absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And Who Is It totally embodies that kind of thesis statement. This song accomplishes so much in 1:41. It has a couple of different sections, some really great guitar work, and a fantastic bass line.
Yeah, I love that walking bass line. The guitars are really upbeat and kind of jazzy. The drums are driving the whole thing. David Byrne's vocals, especially when they get to that kind of start-stop section, are just right on point. It's kind of a fun little ditty, but there's this underlying like nervousness and paranoia to it, especially since most of the lyrics are just "Who is it?" Inquiring who or what is it, in kind of a paranoid way is kind of interesting. But another line I want to highlight, one of the few other lines in this short song, is near the end. "If you don't love me, I don't know what I'm going to do." There's a little bit of desperation there, a little bit of craziness, Maybe perhaps it's the early signs of someone who will end up being a psycho killer?
Whoa. Whoa.
Maybe?
Whoa.
We'll just let that thought simmer. But it is a cool little ditty of a track, and I think that you're right. For being so short, it certainly establishes an identity and makes itself just as memorable as any of the tracks that are twice as long as it.
Yeah, that's really been kind of like my goal in life. I'm a relatively short guy. I'm like 5'9", and I just want to have a strong identity and really establish myself.
This song just mirrors your world, Jake.
It spoke to me, that's for sure. Moving on. Track 6 is called No Compassion.
I guess I've experienced some problems, but now I've made some decisions. It takes a lot of time to push away the nonsense.
No Compassion is my favorite song on Talking Heads 77. It's also the longest song on the album at 4 minutes and 47 seconds. And the thing about Talking Heads is 4 minutes and 47 seconds for most bands is not that long of a song. For Talking Heads, especially this era of Talking Heads, this is a very, very long song for what they were accomplishing in the time that it takes for them to perform a song. This is a little bit darker. You got much more of a post-punk vibe really echoing in the guitars. And this song, the reason why I love it is because there are multiple parts to this song.
Yeah.
And you can really hear the atmosphere building in each individual part. I see a lot of tones that I hear repeating, or Jeff Buckley in his album Grace really drawing influence from the sound that was presented in No Compassion, especially in that guitar, in that performance and the songwriting here. But the guitars on this song are just brilliant. They occupy like these different moods and intensities depending on which section of the song you're in. I thought that this was just the absolute best track on the album. I don't know if you feel that way, Tom.
I
This is
do.
my favorite. Okay, good.
I agree with you. This is one of my favorites on the album. I think this is where we start to get a little bit more edge. The chorus of this song is really one of the most intense parts on the album. It really starts to drive. The guitars are hitting a little harder. David Byrne is getting a little more shouty and a little more intense. I love that. And I love how it contrasts once you get to that point with the slowed down first verse. But then when it goes into the second verse, it maintains the intensity from the chorus. But one of my favorite parts of the whole album is, you know, you mentioned, Jake, that this song has multiple parts. I think that from a songwriting and song structure perspective, it's really brilliant in that way. But my absolute favorite part is when you've already had two of these really big, expansive choruses that really pick up the pace, and then a third one is coming, and David Byrne just goes, "Oh, here we go again." And then it just falls right into a little bit of an instrumental from that chorus, and then the song ends. But I love that, like,
it almost shows like how much of David Byrne's DNA is in the music itself. Like he's feeling it so much. I wonder if he recorded this in like live takes. Because
Maybe.
it seems so natural. Like, you know how like professional basketball players will say that like the basketball is just an extension of their own body. I almost feel like his voice and his vocal persona is just attached to him, and he's not even present as he's belting out these lyrics. All right, Tom, it's time to flip the record.
all right.
Time to get up. We got to walk over to the record player, lift the tone arm, and it's time to flip it. We're going to the B side now, side 2. But no song on the back half of this record should be considered a B side to Talking Head 77 because the back half, in my opinion, is just as strong as the front half. This thing is incredibly balanced throughout the entire record, which is something that for a debut album is the note of a very special band. The first track on the back half, track 7, is called The Book I Read.
To admit it hit the soft spot in my heart when I found out you wrote the book I read. So take my shoulders and put your arms around my little cross.
It has this big piano coupled with the electric guitar, a little bit poppier. It has a chorus married with David Byrne's just emphatic singing, and that piano melody just gets stuck in my head. It's so memorable. But what's interesting is this song actually, where many of the songs before it are using 2 electric guitars. Tom, as you said, they kind of use the double helix television technique for the guitars. This song takes a little bit of a break from that. I noticed on this song you have just one electric guitar, and the other instrument that you hear is the electric keys, and it really they really resonate like an electric guitar would. So it's a subtle difference, but it does change the tone of the song to just feel a little bit more spacey.
Yeah. That's something they do throughout the album really well, though, is they incorporate these other instruments in a way that they blend so well with the instruments that are already there that you don't really even notice them unless you're really paying close attention, like you're trying to pick it apart. And yeah, that electric key sound, that kind of organ sound is one that I picked out there. I also really like when the piano comes in and mimics the bass part. Those two complement each other really well during that na-na-na section.
Track 8 on Talking Head 77 is a track called Don't Worry About the Government.
Building that I want to live in, it's over there, it's over there. My building has every convenience, it's gonna make life easier for
I feel like Donald Trump doesn't want us to worry about the government right now, but over 50% of Americans are definitely worried about the government. That's
probably true at any given time.
The song wasn't written about the American politics in the 2010s, but it does have a major portion of the album's most interesting lyrics. But this is really relatively more of a poppy, upbeat kind of song, at least in its presentation. It kind of has this sadistic tone to it.
It does. There's a sinister undertone there that I love.
Yep.
And these are some of my favorite lyrics on the album. Because he's just singing, like, you listen to this and you're like, what the hell is he singing about? I see the building that I want to live in. It's going to be great. It's going to let me get so much work done. Like, these are the thoughts that he's describing. And especially, I laugh out loud when it gets to the line where, like, I'll be working, but if you come visit, I'll drop what I'm doing because my friends are important. You know, like, it sounds so robotic. It sounds so, like, programmed. In a way, it reminds me of, like, what years later Blur would do with the song Tracy Jacks and what Radiohead would do with the song No Surprises.
I think you meant Tri-State Jazz.
Tri-State Jazz. But both of those songs are about this disenchantment with everyday, just like middle-class working life. And I think that that's kind of what he's doing here. But one of the more interesting things that I think that I would put it to the listener to think about, I won't get too much more into it, but this song is called Don't Worry About the Government. And he never actually mentions the government. He just talks about like this working lifestyle and finding a building that he wants to live in and having friends come visit. Like, the government isn't really mentioned. It's very personal. So what does that say? I feel like he's inviting some sort of deeper analysis into what this song is about. But I think that blends in with the kind of sinister undertone, especially when you get to the very bare, don't worry about me, repeating line. That kind of false convincing of, I'm fine, don't worry about me. I'm doing just fine. I'm loving life.
What if the character is the government? I feel like, Tom, if we smoke enough pot about this, we'll come to the answer.
That's the secret. I just haven't done enough of that.
Yeah, well, someday. Moving on. Track 9 on this wonderful first album by Talking Heads is First Week / Last Week ... Carefree. One thing that I have to note in this song before I hand it off to you, Tom, is the absolute killer saxophone that gets added here.
I love it.
It's really a nice touch, and I don't believe we've heard the saxophone introduced into the mix until this song. The other element of this song that is really interesting is at the end of the song, David Byrne goes absolutely nuts on all these vocal flourishes. He's not even saying anything. He's just making sounds with his voice, and it just adds to that persona of mania that he's trying to present or is presenting throughout this. You really don't know if it's just a persona or if it's just him at this point, because this album has taken you all over the place. David Byrne is unraveling on stage as he's singing these songs to you, and at the end of this song, he's not even saying words anymore.
Yeah, and the saxophone is killer. There's also a nice Wiro accompaniment and the auxiliary percussion in there.
What is a Wiro? Help me out here.
A
What is a
Wiro?
Wiro? Yeah, I don't know what a Wiro is. Tom has gotten out of his chair, walked off camera. Oh, he's back. Oh, it's the wooden fish thing.
Yeah.
He's gonna play for us on. Oh wow! Look at this. It's like I'm back in kindergarten.
Exactly.
I played a Wiro in kindergarten. I just never knew what it was called.
Yeah, I got one here. It's all
That's
good.
awesome. That's thank you for that, Tom. Tom, why do you own a Wiro?
I needed it.
Are you a weirdo with a Wiro?
The saxophone to me once again makes this feel like some kind of game show or like public access thing. Like it's so sugary and it's so schmaltzy, but it's wonderful. It's a great part. But I love to think about the I'm gonna bring this back to my conspiracy theory of this being a concept album. The song right before this was about someone finding a building they want to live in and moving into it and being really excited about getting so much work done. And now we've got first week / last week ... carefree. I actually think that's a pretty loaded song title. You're going from the first week of a job to the last week of a job. Last week could have kind of a double meaning. Does it just mean the previous week or your actual final week? And also that carefree with the ... before it sounds really fake to me. Sounds like someone trying to convince you not to worry about them like they were in the previous song. But I love the kind of tongue-in-cheek like workplace lyrics in this song, like this report's incomplete and every appointment has been moved to last week. That doesn't even make sense. So, and that in line with what you were saying, Jake, about the kind of like nonsense lyrics at the end where he's just kind of doing these vocal runs that feel very improvised and nonsensical. You get a sense that things are starting to become unhinged in this kind of working class fantasy life, which then brings us conveniently into track 10, Psycho Killer.
Psycho killer, qu'est-ce que c'est? Fa 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 fa. Better run. Oh.
There is a reason why Psycho Killer is a classic song. I think, Tom, this is one of the most well-written songs of the 1970s and
I love
maybe
it.
of all time.
Yeah.
But the way that it just kind of stomps at the beginning with the bass and the bass drum, that beat is just so steady and haunting. And the lyrics of this song, I'll let you speak to them, are absolutely fantastic. This songwriting grips you from the first moment. And when that clangy guitar comes in, it embodies one of the things that I love about Talking Head 77. What makes this sound and this album and really this band so darn remarkable is that they can make music that is inherently fun to listen to while also approaching serious subjects in the lyrics and the moods. And that all comes to a head in Psycho Killer.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite songs ever, and to me, it is the pinnacle of this album. Yep. David Byrne is actually like he's confused by the fact that people like this song so much because him and the rest of the band thought it was kind of jokey, but I think it's brilliant. I particularly love in the chorus when things drop out during the fa 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 part, back to just the bass line. It had some nice dynamic contrast. And then when the vocals get more crazed during the end and in the second verse even where it's more like spoken word, the guitars get kind of crazy at the end to match that. And it has this almost kind of like indie rock feel of what we would hear 20, 30 years later with bands like Built to Spill and Modest Mouse. Like just this weird kind of bendy guitar bit. But then, the lyrics, I mean, he's singing about a psycho killer, but there's really not even a lot of details given, which is why, for me as a listener, I'm forced to relate it back to the context of the rest of the album. And I feel like it begs the question of, is this the natural conclusion of the working class monotony that's been hammered into us throughout the album? And when I say hammered into us, I mean us meaning the listeners, and us meaning the narrators in the songs, and how it represents just the everyday person. I think that then this song takes a different meaning when put in the context of the album than it would just listening to on its own. But the brilliant thing about it is it serves a dual purpose, because it's just a freaking good song on its own anyway. And that's the mark of when you just have a truly great, thoughtful artist, is someone who can make a standalone masterpiece track, but something that also contributes to a bigger picture on an album. I think that's become something of a lost art.
Many people will probably end the album listen at Psycho Killer at the end of the as Psycho Killer finishes playing out. There still is one more fantastic track on this album, and that's the closing track, track 11, Pulled Up.
I was complaining, I was down in the dumps. I felt so strong now 'cause you pulled me up, 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 up.
I believe Pulled Up is a great closer, and I have to admit that in previous listens before preparing to this, I probably didn't give this song its due, because it follows Psycho Killer and it follows what is a pretty amazing album. On the surface, Pulled Up really isn't all that different from the rest of the album, but what I noticed in really diving into the details of this song is that it is definitely... It has a very upbeat and fun vibe, much more so than the rest of the record, but it's still pushing the limits of all that instrumentation and that interesting songwriting. It's really taking all the things that all those sonic motifs that we've heard throughout Talking Heads 77 and just doing them more, right? And doing so in a very succinct, well-written way. It's a very nice way to wrap up everything that this album is. It's that concluding paragraph to the essay that is Talking Heads 77.
I completely agree. I couldn't say it better. It almost freaks me out sometimes, Jake, when you and I just agree so much. Like, I want to disagree with you sometimes because it makes the conversation interesting, but you just take the words right from me. It's perfect.
10 years of us detail listening to music together and then recording our thoughts and putting them on the internet will do that to you, Tom. It will do that to you.
It's true. The only thing I want to add is you mentioned that this is like the closing paragraph. It's like the epilogue. And this is the song that when I first got to it, I'm like, man, does this song completely discredit my crazy concept album theory? And
did you pull up on that theory when you heard this song? Oh,
no. What I did was I just found a way to justify it.
Oh, there you go.
So here's what I think. Look at the very first two lines of this song. It's, "Mommy, Daddy, come look at me now. I'm a big man in a great big town." This is someone just reaching adulthood. You know what I think it is? It's a new narrator, and I think that it's putting forth the idea that the cycle is happening again. I think that with Pulled Up, what they're doing is they're taking this evolution to becoming a psycho killer and making the point that it's going to happen again with someone else. And it's to some extent, it's going to happen with everyone. It's a cyclical thing.
Modern society is a psycho killer factory.
Yes, exactly.
It's the industrial machine, man.
Exactly. And this song kind of represents...
I am way too sober for this conversation right now.
And it's in a way, it kind of embodies every one of those elements. Jake, you already said this song is even brighter and more upbeat than some. It's optimistic. It matches with the lyrics. But at the same time, it gets increasingly crazed throughout, which we saw in some of the earlier songs that kind of felt like a mental breakdown. By the end of it, he's kind of yelping, and it sounds a little desperate and crazed, but still you have that driving, upbeat instrumentation. So That's my theory. And now I will never be able to listen to this album the same way ever again.
Neither
Because-
will I, and probably anyone who listens to this podcast will never listen to this album again, which honestly, that's a good thing. That's what we want. We want to make you think about the music differently. So I'm glad
true.
we went through this exercise, Tom. I'm glad you put out there your theory.
Yeah. Well, I never would have thought of it if I didn't take the time to listen to this. And one thing I really wanted to break down is like, what is David Byrne doing in the lyrics? And that just feels like it could be, a kind of narrative arc. But aside from all that, I love the songwriting. I love the production. I haven't even talked about the bass in particular. The bass is one of my favorite parts of this album. It's nimble and punchy. Tina Weymouth's playing is just great. I mean, this is just a band who started at a peak that most bands could only dream of getting to, and then still found a way to surpass that.
Yep.
I think that's really monumental.
That's a nice way to put it. And I also had a note written about Tina Weymouth and the amazing job she does on bass. I thought the bass guitar is without it, the sound wouldn't be there. It wouldn't hit on all cylinders. And I really appreciated that through the listen. To wrap up this album review, Tom, what are your top 3 favorite tracks of Talking Heads 77?
I mean, as cliche as it is, Psycho Killer. Psycho Killer's my number one. That song just gets me. I think probably because it's one of the more catchy, but it also just features a lot of dynamic contrast. I think the other 2 that would round out my top 3 would be Tentative Decisions and No Compassion.
Yeah, I'm very similar. I think my favorite song on the record happens to be No Compassion. I like that. I think I like it as an individual piece more than I like Psycho Killer. Psycho Killer is a great song, and it's impossible not to dance to it and to really get it stuck in your head. Mm-hmm. But just the substance there is, as you said, there's not a ton going on in that song. And just comparing it to track 6, No Compassion, where that song is just all over the place. It accomplishes just what I've heard 10 to 15 minute long songs do, and it does it in under 5 minutes.
Yeah.
It blows me away. So No Compassion, definitely my favorite, followed by Psycho Killer. And then I would throw in track 2, New Feeling. I really thought that the guitars on that song really got me. Honorable mention to the opening track, Uh-Oh, Love Comes to Town. I cheated a little bit.
It's all right. You're allowed to.
Questions for the listeners. What are your favorite tracks from Talking Heads 77? And how does Talking Heads 77 fit in your favorite Talking Heads album? What number is it in relation? I think I agree with Tom. Remain in Light will always be my favorite Talking Heads record, but this is a close second to me and has been for a little bit now. Really happy to have gone through this. So Jeremy, thank you again for giving us the opportunity to dive back into our roots, select an album, and go through it with vigor and an extreme amount of thoroughness. That wraps up Talking Head 77. I want to challenge all of you still listening. If you liked this format, if you like Tom and I taking one album and really doing a deep dive on it and walking through it track by track, let us know. Either leave us a comment on our Facebook page or just send us an email at velocitiesinmusic@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. We love that dialogue. It's what Velocities in Music is all about. And we really try to take the time and engage with our listeners who reach out to us. We want to have these discussions with you, and we love it when you're as enthused about music as we are. Thank you guys for your continued support and participation. Tom and I love all of your comments on our YouTube videos, your Facebook messages, and especially your emails to us. Your participation is what makes Velocities in Music possible. So, as always, thanks for being awesome. We'll see you next time. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music, moving music discussion forward.